Welcome to the Big Game Hunting Podcast, where we help hunters like you prepare for the big game hunting adventures you've always dreamed of. Now, here's your host, John McAdams.
Hello, John McAdams here. Welcome to episode 304 of the Big Game Hunting Podcast. It is springtime, and at least for me anyway, this is a time of hope and exuberance for the coming year. Everything is starting to come back to life after the cold, dark, and gray winter. Right now, the landscape is starting to green up, the dogwoods in my part of the country are in bloom, and the days are starting to get longer. We're also right in the heart of application season right now, and spirits are high with lots of potential for some cool hunts in the upcoming season. So with this in mind, I'm joined by two gentlemen from the Harvesting Nature crew who experienced some of the highs and lows of elk season out west last year, Justin Townsend and Casey Nordine. As you'll learn here shortly, both had some very different hunting experiences. However, there are also some important similarities in their hunts as well. Both guys hunted elk in 2023 in some areas where tags weren't especially difficult to obtain. And both guys actually got into elk while they were out there too. And both guys dealt with some adversity of varying kinds out there afield. So the purpose of this episode is to demonstrate that, yes, you can do it. You can get the necessary tags. You can find elk, and you can kill an elk. However, there will be unexpected challenges out there. Not everything is under your control, and the best you can do sometimes is to just roll with the punches and do your best to adapt and overcome. Now, the states of Montana and Colorado feature prominently in this episode. Both states actually have application deadlines coming up. This episode will air on 28 March. Montana's deer and elk application deadline is 1 April, and Colorado's all-species deadline is 2 April. Both states have some fantastic hunting opportunities, and I recommend looking into both of them if you are interested in coming out west to hunt deer and or elk, and some other species, but we'll focus mainly on deer and elk right now. So to that end, now is a great time to get a Go Hunt Insider membership if you don't already have one, so you can start researching the details of both states. And the same is also true with other states like Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming that have later application deadlines. Go Hunt was essential to my success on every single one of my out-of-state hunts over the past 8 years when it comes to selecting the right hunt to apply for, to drawing the actual tag, to planning the hunt, and to putting it all together afield. Click the link in the show notes and sign up for an insider membership today. Enter promo code BIGGAMEHUNTER when you do that to get $50 in store credit at their gear shop as a free bonus. Next, do me a big favor, hit that subscribe or follow button in the podcast app you are listening to the show on. And if you haven't already done so, please leave me a rating and or a review too. Doing both of those things really helps me out, helps me reach other hunters like you who enjoy this stuff, and plus you'll also start to receive future episodes automatically after you subscribe. And finally, make sure you're on my email list. To do that, click the link in the show notes or go to huntingguns101.com. Sign up there for my free ebook on the best hunting cartridges. You'll get that ebook when you do so, plus you'll also start to receive the emails I send out every weekday. If you like the podcast, you'll love those emails. So make sure you are getting them too by going to huntingguns101.com and signing up there. All right, let's get started talking to Casey and Justin about their 2023 elk hunts. All right, Justin, Casey, it is great talking to you guys tonight. We've been trying to set this up for a while, but we finally just got the time with everyone's schedules to get it all together. But you guys each had some very unique elk hunting experiences this past year, but at the same time, both of them really fall within the spectrum of what someone might reasonably expect to have happen to them on an elk hunt, from one extreme to another, perhaps there, but nothing totally wild and crazy going on here. And so I thought it would be very interesting to sit you guys down, talk with you at the same time, and let you relate these stories and everything that happened with your elk hunts to my audience, and kind of give people maybe a taste of what sort of things they could expect on an elk hunt out west.
No, that's awesome. I think fair. Yeah. Excited.
Well, can you each maybe take like 30 seconds just to introduce yourself to the audience? Justin, we'll start with you. Sorry, right as you're taking a drink. Sorry.
All good. It was poor timing on my part. No, my name is Justin Townsend. So I'm the founder and CEO of Harvesting Nature. And so Harvesting Nature itself is an online media platform and educational resource for hunters and anglers. So we do a lot of our outreach and education focused on wild food. So not as much what to do during the hunt or how to hunt, but more like how do you handle your game or fish or forageables whenever you come back home and get back in the kitchen. So just want to maximize that. But former professional chef, cooking off and on for about 12 years. Long time outdoor writer at this point, and just great to be on the show. Excited to chat with you again, John.
Well, good deal. It's good to have you. So, Casey, tell everyone a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, Casey Nordine. I live in the Black Hills of South Dakota. I've been business manager for Harvesting Nature for about 2.5 years now. Help with scheduling events, new products, articles, kind of whatever Justin throws in my direction. So try and work as closely with Justin as I can without driving one another up a wall, I think. But we get along pretty well.
Okay, good deal.
Yeah.
All right, well, Justin, let's start with you. Give us the 30,000-foot view of what happened with your elk season this past year, and we'll dive into details as necessary.
Sure. So I guess let's start kind of in the fall, early fall. So this year I hunted 2 different, I guess, weapon types. So I hunted archery in early season. Matter of fact, like the opening weekend, was out on public land, not super successful. Didn't really get into elk, spooked some here and there. And then sort of later in the year for rifle season in third rifle. So all of this, of course, taking place in Colorado. In third rifle season, I decided to go up and do a hunt up in kind of north central Colorado, and ran into a lot of public land pressure. And I've heard people talk sort of about the Orange Army out there, and I think this was my first instance where I really ran into it. And it varied day by day. It took me about 3 or 4 days to kind of get tuned in and finally get into elk. And then, unfortunately, I ran out of time on my own personal clock. But definitely a lot of lessons learned, I think, with that, going, just as hard as I could for those 4 days into the elk hunting in that area. But yeah, definitely challenging and slightly frustrating as well, too.
So you live in Colorado, right?
Correct. Yeah, I'm in Denver.
And so you were hunting, I'm assuming, on an over-the-counter elk tag. Is that right?
Yep, correct. Yeah, both for the archery and for the rifle too. Yeah, I typically don't try to put in for any of the draws. Like, I've only been here a couple of years. I don't really have any preference points, and sometimes it takes a gazillion points to even get a good draw zone.
Yeah, it seems like Colorado is an interesting state where there are a couple of units that are just have a reputation for being fantastic, and it takes you 25 plus points to draw them, and you have no chance of getting them otherwise. And there's maybe a handful of units that are like that, and then, I mean, it seems like 70, 80% of the rest of the state you can either get with just a couple points, or you can hunt on an over-the-counter elk tag like that. Now, these OTC tags, you said you were going out in the third rifle season. Are all the OTC tags for that season or for archery?
So you get them, I'm going to misquote this. For archery season, it's a mix of draw tags. There are zones that you can put in draw for, and then there are zones that are bull only, and then there's zones that are cow only. But then you get into like the point of where you have A tags, B tags, and C tags. So there's a certain combination that you can only have with a single species. So like you can only have one A tag and one B tag, or you can have 2 B tags, or you can have, I think an unlimited amount of C tags with any combination. So that definitely, you have to kind of play a little bit of chess when you think about how you're going to draw it out. Like my first year out here, I went out with some friends elk hunting. for archery, and we were going to go to one zone that was in the list of over the counter for cow tags, which that's what I was going to do. That was listed as a B tag, but we switched in the last week and decided to go with one of the zones that was an A tag for a bull. And so I burnt my A tag for that year, and all the over the counter rifle tags for bull are A tags. So I wasn't able to get another one of those tags that year. So kind of a little frustrating too. That was a little beginner's nuance I picked up.
And it seems like the third rifle season. Well, what were your approximate dates of your hunt for your third rifle tag?
It would have been. Oh man, I can't think of off the top of my head. I think it was the first or second week in November.
Okay, so a little bit later in the season too. I mean, like you would expect with a third season hunt like that. And so that first season is probably kind of the more desirable tags to get. Maybe you're hunting them in September during the rut or soon thereafter. And by the time you're making it out there, people have been messing with the elk for a while. And plus there's just thousands of other hunters out there with you.
Yeah. And the challenge you get into is, weather shapes it a lot. I think you can go and scout elk in September or early October, and they're going to be in a completely different spot than they're going to be like beginning mid-November. And last year, I drew a fourth rifle tag for up by Steamboat Springs, which actually that area got hit super hard last winter. But I hunted it before the winter was really, really bad, and it was kind of like I ran up into the wall of weather, essentially, like all the snow and everything. So like the places that you would normally get back into the backcountry for elk, you couldn't access if you didn't have a snowmobile or like cross country skis or snowshoes, because you were post holing through, like 2 feet of snow trying to get back into where the elk were at.
Geez, and I'll bet that probably saved you a lot of trouble too, because if you would have shot an elk back there like that, that would have been a nightmare getting that thing out, wouldn't it?
Yeah, no, the thought ran in through my mind. Like we got into some tracks. We were probably 3 miles back or so, and I was like, "This is going to be a challenge to pack this out of here if we get onto the animal." So, yeah, lots of lessons learned.
Now, but do I understand right that you did eventually get into elk on this hunt, and you actually saw elk, but weren't able to close the deal for a variety of reasons?
Yeah, so on the last day of the hunt, I got into one of the state parks here, and the state parks, some of them you're allowed to hunt big game, some you're only allowed to hunt small game. It really just kind of depends on where you're at and the regulations in that park. But this one particular, my thought was part of the land I wanted to access was up above the state park, so I had to get into the state park in order to get up to it. And then also you have to pay to access the state park. So then automatically I'm like, that's going to weed out sort of a portion of the folks that are going to try to access this land and hunt on it. So I went in the last day and I was like, I picked a parking spot, I picked a trailhead, and I saw it like wind up the mountain up to the top. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to hike as far as I can up this mountain until I get into elk sign and just kind of like see. Well, it was 3 miles up into it, and it was exactly 9,200 feet. Because I remember checking Onyx, at the exact time, and like I hit 9,200 feet and I hit elk track, and I was like, all right, there's sign everywhere. I'm starting to see scat, and this was just on the maintained trail too. So there was a lot of clear cut timber up at that level. And I rounded a bend and just like peeked up to the edge, and there was a herd of elk, probably 230 yards away, which was it's a perfectly reasonable shot for me. And I glassed them for probably about 10, 15 minutes, and all I could pick out was cow elk and spike bulls. And this particular zone had an antler restriction, so I wasn't able to pick any off. And I kind of continued on a little further up, down and up the trail to kind of look to see if I could spot any, lone bulls or any other sign that indicate. And then of course it was at this point 3.5, 4 miles back down to the trailhead, and I was going to race a little bit against time, getting out before dark. So I just kind of like shucked it off as a loss and pushed back towards the car. But it was cool to finally get into the elk and realize kind of all the steps leading up to it had been, worth it to be like, all right, I'm trusting my instincts and then like I'm making the right decisions, even though the elk weren't the mature elk weren't where they other elk were. If that makes sense. There you go.
Okay, fair enough. That all does make sense. Very interesting progression there. We'll put a pin in that and we'll come back and talk to you more about this here in a second. So Casey, let's switch gears and talk about your side of things. Once again, high level details. What happened with you this past year?
Yeah. This past year was a bit of an anomaly in that I was able to pull 2 bull elk tags, one for South Dakota where I'm resident, and then a non-resident general tag for Montana. And so typically it's already a stretch to make the most of one season. And then when you have the pressure of two really high end tags, it's a little more stressful, but high level, my brother and I went out to Montana for the archery season. So for those that don't know, if you get a general Montana elk tag, you can pay, it's not much. I think it's $10 or $20 for the archery permit. And that enables you to hunt the early archery season as well as the rifle season. And so we went out for about 10 days of the archery season. I won't go into all the grueling details, but it was very feast or famine during that time frame. And then I had to cut that trip a little bit short to get back to South Dakota. It's basically a once in a lifetime tag for a resident. It takes about 25 years to draw that tag. And then you can't even start applying again for another 9 years. So had to get back to run some trail cameras and do some scouting for the last few days before that season kicked off on October 1st. And that was a rifle tag with the option to hunt archery, but being a once in a lifetime tag, I was happy to take the rifle out there. And rut seemed to be a little late this year, so it was a lot of fun because they were pretty much in full rut that first week of October. So lots of activity and not having to get quite as close as you would with a bow.
Man, that is really cool. So you don't hear so much about elk hunting in South Dakota. So it sounds like it is just very tightly managed, very limited opportunities. And so it's really good if you draw the tag, but there's just not a lot of opportunities to get that tag. Is that right?
Yeah. So it is for residents only. It's split into a few different units. So there, I believe, are 4 different Black Hills National Forest units. And then there's a couple of prairie elk units. Justin, you mentioned state parks. There's a state park unit. So there's a handful of opportunities, but if a resident were to spend their whole life in the state, odds are you'd maybe get 2 to 3 elk licenses total in a lifetime, and no non-resident tag allocation. So Black Hills National Forest is just a relatively small mountainous area. And so the herd size is relatively limited compared to the larger mountain states. So for that reason, the tags are tightly managed.
But you managed to get one. Your season started on October 1st, rifle tag, and then the elk are still bugling and rutting when you get out there. So how did things go once you made it afield?
Yeah. The first day out, I got on to elk that afternoon and evening. And I wouldn't consider myself a trophy hunter. I like a big animal, a big mature buck or bull as much as the next guy, but meat's kind of the number one thing on my mind, and then followed up by the chase. So this being kind of a limited trophy type tag was a different mentality for me. So that first night out, did get in on a 6-point bull at about 100 yards. Watched him through the glass for a little while, determined that it wasn't when I wanted to put my tag on for the first day. So I let him walk, and then got out the next few days, got into elk every day. Like I said, the weather was good, kind of, 50-degree highs, lots of rut activity, lots of bugling. So it's a lot of fun getting in on the elk every day. And then would have been the third day into the season, I was able to get in on a couple of bulls that were firing back at one another. Wasn't able to seal the deal that night. I had kind of a target bull that I got within maybe 75 yards of, but he had 30 or 40 cows that were weaving in and out. So every time I caught him in the scope, he had elk behind him or in front of him and just couldn't seal the deal that night. So I was able to go back to the same area the next morning, which would have been the 4th day of the season. And that's when I ended up getting in on the herd that I was able to capitalize on. So
Was that the same elk that you'd seen the previous day that you couldn't shoot that you ended up killing?
So it's a little bit of a sore subject, but I can't complain about a successful hunt. So
All right.
there was my target bull, and then there was a younger bull, still a mature 6-point, just not the monster that the other one was.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the two bulls that had been fighting the night before. And so that morning I got onto a large herd, hoping that it was the big bull. The way that it worked out was I located them right before first light bugled. They responded, and we were on top of each other within a couple of minutes. I saw the elk moving through the trees at about 100 yards, and I couldn't tell which bull it was. I knew it was a mature herd bull. He was the only bull in the group with about 20 cows. So I'd kind of decided at that point, I'm going to be happy with whatever happens. If I get an opportunity, I'll take it, not knowing which bull it is. It's one or the other. So it ended up being the smaller of the two, but like I said, totally can't complain.
And so you said it was a 6-point though, right?
It was, yeah. He was a 6-point, definitely a herd bull. I thought I had bumped him. He came out to my cow calls at about 100, maybe even less, maybe 80 yards. And he had me pinned, but it was that low light point in the morning where he couldn't really tell what I was, and I had good wind. And so I just froze and kind of let them work up the hill. I thought they were going to be gone for good, but then I crept forward after a few minutes, and they had slowed down after about 40 yards and were just feeding on a hillside. It was a pretty steep pitch, and lots of ponderosa pine in the area that I was hunting. So could just catch glimpses of the elk moving back and forth and that bull trying to keep track of all of his cows. So he was the hardest one to keep track of, but he had been wallowing that night. So he was all covered up in mud. So it made him a little easier to track down. So I got an opportunity at about 120 yards. Cow called, got him to stop in an opening, made a good shot. He ran up the hill with the cows, and they went over a steep ridge pretty quickly. And so most elk started to disappear. I cow called and got him to stop one more time on that ridge and got a second shot. So.
Yeah, I've heard that I've killed one elk, so yeah, I'm not necessarily an expert on that, but everything I've heard about elk is that they're just darn tough animals, and you get an opportunity to put another bullet in them, you do it, because you don't know, you may have made a perfect shot with that first shot, but who knows how far they can go with it, right?
Yeah, that's Justin and I and our crew, we talk about that in some of our hunt camps. Is on that first shot, making a clean, ethical shot is priority number one. And if you're not comfortable, don't take the shot. Mm-hmm. Where I kind of throw that out the window is once I've already hit the animal. If I know I have a mortally wounded animal, but I don't want them to get away, I'm going to take any reasonable shot there following up, just because, especially with something like an elk, they're so tough. If they get into a certain terrain, nothing feels worse than wounding or losing an animal. So keep shooting until they're down. Yeah. My second elk story of the year kind of falls more in line with that one. The first elk in October in South Dakota, 2 clean shots, and he had tipped over on that ridge I had mentioned, just 10 yards over the other side. I didn't know that, so I waited for about an hour and started tracking, and there was no blood. I could follow his foot tracks going up the hill, so I went from being really excited to really worried quickly. But got to the ridge, and I was like, well, I'm going to peek over. If I don't see him, I'll back out, give him some more time. And I walked up to the edge, and there he was, just a few feet away. So,
did either of those shots exit?
No, good question. So I was shooting a 270 Win, 135 grain copper impact. I really like that ammo and that gun. And both I retrieved on the opposite side between flesh and hide. So full pass through on the cavity and then lodged between the hide and the flesh.
What did those bullets look like when you pulled them out?
Perfect mushroom. We've done some ballistic testing with them at some of our camps, and it's probably about 98% weight retention. They've got a little polymer tip on them, so they obviously lose that, but mushroom and perform really well.
Okay, well, good deal. So it sounds like you said, yeah, great penetration, but just not quite all the way out, and that's probably why why he didn't go far, but why you also didn't find a lot of blood from him either. Then,
right? Yep.
Yeah, that's.
I always feel like I'm a little undersized with the 270, but good all around caliber.
It is. I'm not going to give you a hard time for using a 270 on an elk. It clearly worked, and that's also one of these things too that there's a lot of stuff that won't exit an elk, especially for certain shot angles and whatnot. So on this hunt, it sounds like it was a really hard to get tag. The hard part with that, as far as getting away from other hunters, is getting the tag in the first place. Did you encounter any other hunters when you were out there on this hunt?
Yeah, and that's kind of a multifaceted question because there's other seasons that are open during elk season. So there was a lot of archery deer hunters out at the same time. Kind of the bane of my existence is side by side hunting, and there's a time and place for everything. But there was a goofy bunch of guys from I won't say where they're from because I don't want to give them a bad reputation, but
yeah.
They were just cruising around on a side by side with a knocked arrow for like a week, and then complaining about not seeing deer. And I tried to explain that if they turned the side by side off and maybe walked a little ways off the trails, they'd have better luck. So there's a lot of deer traffic, and then there was some other elk traffic out there, but it's one of those scenarios, and I feel like a lot of places are like this, where if you're willing to get even a half mile, 3/4 of a mile off the main drag, you're going to start getting away from people and having more luck.
Well, tell us about your Montana elk hunt now.
Yeah. So when we were out there mid-September and looking at the moon phases and peak rut for this year, everything said that it should have been really good. And we got there, I think it was on the 15th of September, went to a spot where I had some close calls with bulls the year prior. And I had a nice mature bull at 50 yards within 30 minutes of the first morning. I mean, there was bugles almost every time we called, we got a response. I had a really small shot opening on that first bull. I wasn't comfortable trying to sneak it through a small gap, and it seemed like the opportunities would be endless with the amount of encounters we were having. And that was kind of the first day, was just nonstop action. We didn't end up punching a tag that day, but we were feeling really good. And then the rest of the trip, it really just shut off. The rut activity went from craziness to next to nothing. We put on a lot of miles. We ended up, after a few days of just, crickets out in the woods, we ended up doing more spot and stock stuff, trying to catch stuff moving from grazing back into bedding, more locate and sneak in than just trying to call something in, because the activity just did a complete 180. So that was kind of the story of the first week or so with archery. That's when I said I came back and kind of prepped for the South Dakota hunt. And then fortunately, the benefit of my South Dakota hunt being done in just a few days was that it freed up a little bit of time to go back to Montana. So that's when the archery season ended and rifle season kicked off. So we went back about the second weekend in November and put on a few miles. It was kind of miserable conditions. It had snowed the week prior and then rained the entire time we were there. So you're just walking around in slush and puddles and everything's soaked within a matter of minutes. So one of those times where you just can't get warm, can't get dry. It's a little bit of a suffer fest, but sure makes it memorable. And then we did that for about 2 or 3 days, and it came down to our last morning. We knew we had just a couple hours to try and get something done. Otherwise, we'd have to drive back to South Dakota. And we had gotten done with our morning hunt, and we were driving to a different area. And along the way, we saw a couple of herds out in some agricultural areas. And for those that don't know, in Montana, there's a private land for public hunting program called block management. And there's a few different varieties of block management, but in large part, a lot of them require a sign-in from the hunter before you can access the property. And so we were able to take advantage of that. We knew of a couple of ranches that were enrolled in this program and kind of seemed to be in the direction that the herds were heading. And so we kind of hedged our bets, signed into those areas, and just glassed from afar for a couple of hours. And sure enough, the elk just kept moving that way and kept moving that way. And so we'd slide the truck down a half mile and set up again in glass. And eventually it was like, well, if they keep on that trajectory, they're going to end up on the ranch that we're signed in on. no one else is there.
Mm-hmm.
And so sure enough, it kind of got to that point where we're like, well, we should head down there and get in on that property. And it seemed like it was probably going to be another 15 to 20 minutes before the herd made its way onto that piece that we could hunt. And as is the case with elk, things can transpire more quickly than you anticipate. And so we thought we would have plenty of time to get set up. And by the time we had gotten to the check-in station and over the fence and back into that property a little ways, I pulled up my binoculars, and the herd was at that moment crossing the fence onto the ranch in which we could hunt. So it turned into a fire drill really quickly. I give my brother a hard time. He's a lot shorter than I am. I'm almost 6'5". He's maybe 6 foot. So I give him a hard time, but I felt bad because I just, I had that switch go off in my brain. Like, you got to make it happen. And so I sprinted ahead maybe 100 yards to try and get in position. And there in this area, you could shoot any branch antlered bull with brow tines, or a cow could not shoot spikes. So this herd had one raghorn, 5x4, maybe 10 cows, and then a couple of spikes. So having already shot a decent bull this year, I wasn't really tied in knots about horns, but wanting to fill a tag and fill the freezer. And I ran up and had an opportunity at the bull. So I kind of left my brother in the dust and shot that bull. But then luckily that herd circled back around in his direction and gave him a good shot opportunity. And so he was able to fill his tag on one of the cows in that same herd. So,
whew, man,
that's probably the first time we've doubled on elk. We've doubled on deer before. So that's always a memorable experience. And the fact that it was our last morning of the hunt was fun too. Made for a lot of work in a short amount of time, but
whew, man. So you talk about, and so the block management, I'm assuming, is this a sort of deal where you're hunting on private land that the state has worked out a deal with the landowner? Hey, we'll pay you some money, but you need to let the public access your land. Is that right?
You got it. Yeah. And there's 3 varieties. So, and don't quote me on which is which, but the one version is it's just open. So a lot of states would have this version where if it's marked as private land for public hunting, you just park the truck and walk in. Typically there's no vehicle access, but that's the easiest version. Mm-hmm. The most common form in Montana, the second version would be the type I mentioned, where you have to go to a check-in box that's located on the property. You give them all of your personal details, contact information. And then there's a slip for you to put into the box and a slip for you to have on you. So people have gotten themselves into hot water before where, they see a big deer bull run by and they shoot it in an area where they would be allowed to hunt, but didn't do their due diligence and check in, and they end up having the animal confiscated or fines or worse, just because they weren't paying attention to the regulations. And then the third version would be a little more involved. And I have hunted in some of these areas where a landowner might be willing to participate in the state with this public access opportunity, but maybe they say, our area really only facilitates 3 hunters a day. Mm-hmm. And so it's mandated that only 3 people can be in there. There's a 1-800 number. Basically, you call the state and you say, here's the number for the block management unit I would like to hunt. I'm seeing if there's accessibility today. They'll tell you yes or no. And in some scenarios, they may even say, how many days would you like to hunt it? So you could say, I'd like to hunt it for the next 3 days. They put you in on the docket. So then, in that scenario, okay, I've got this piece of property. There's not going to be any more than 2 other people out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, good deal. So you hunted on or you shot that elk on block management. What kind of land did you shoot your elk in South Dakota on? Was it national forest?
Yeah. Yep. That is the perk of living in the Black Hills, is a lot of national forest in a state. I think we're maybe 7 or 8% public. The vast majority, it's right around the area that I live. So, okay. Mainly Forest Service. There are opportunities for people to typically, get a guide and go hunt some private ranches that are surrounded by public. But that is the perk of that tag, is lots of public access.
So, Justin, in your case, you said you hunted towards the end of your hunt in a state park or in the vicinity of a state park?
So it was a combination. I mean, honestly, I think that hunt, I was just looking at the map here. So while I was there, in this zone, I hunted on forestry land, and then I hunted some BLM land, and then some state trust land, which is very similar to like what Casey described. That'd be the equivalent in Colorado, where you have like a landowner allows Colorado Parks and Wildlife to grant access to hunters. There's usually, I think it differs slightly from Montana. They generally don't have check stations. Some may or may not have reservation systems, but they're delineated by species type. So you have to pull it up and see what species you're allowed to hunt on that particular piece of property. And then I hunted the state wildlife areas, which is the state owned and state managed wildlife areas, and then in a state park. So really, I kind of ran the gambit.
My goodness, yeah.
Yeah. That zone I hunted was pretty high for public access opportunities, which was really good. This is one of the reasons why I selected it. And two, I'd just never been up there before, so it looked kind of a fun spot to go.
You know, with your experience seeing all those hunters out there, were you seeing a big difference between the number of people that were out there during the weekend versus the week or anything like that?
No, I think it was pretty consistent. So with Colorado's rifle seasons, like they actually reduced them this year because in some areas, but they typically run like 6 days. So you'll get people, especially people that are traveling into state, they'll make the commitment and they'll come out for the full 6 days. And like what's really common is you'll get a group of guys get together. They'll have their guide tents, their side by sides, their whatever, and they'll set up a spot and then just all kind of branch out from there. So usually people will commit to the full time period when they come out.
Yeah, I drew an elk tag in Arizona a couple of years ago, and this is a really, really big unit, but there was several hundred tags that were allocated for this unit. And, those first couple of days out there, there's just people everywhere, right? Driving down the road, just tent, camper, other guys on the roads and all that. And, we saw some other people out there when we were like actually hunting. A couple a day, right? And sometimes it was a pain in the rear, sometimes it wasn't. But I kept waiting for all these people to go home at the end of the weekend, and they just never did. Man, the same deal. They were just, they took off work and they were out there for the duration of the hunt or until they headed home. So I've experienced that in some areas, maybe where it's like a really long season, maybe a month or a couple weeks or something like that. You'll see a big rush out there during opening weekend, and then it dies down a little bit and it kind of has peaks and valleys. But man, those short seasons like you're talking about, or like especially like in New Mexico, like their rifle season that you draw a tag is 5 days long. Like most guys, like they're going to be out there the whole time or until they get it, that sort of thing. But you said that you had the best success in getting away from people going into this particular state park then, right?
Yeah, so I'll kind of go back a little bit. So I was out there like 4 days total, and that's kind of when I go to a new area, I try to allot like four to 6 days because usually, through my experience, I've learned like it takes me about 3 to 4 days to figure it out in order to get on game, which happened in this scenario, just not the game that I needed it to be. But the first day I got out there and explored some forestry land, and it was one of those scenarios that I was just I picked a forestry road I was going to go up to the top and basically park up on a ridge. And, I passed camps, I passed RVs, I passed side-by-sides. I kept, going. And then like even the spot where I parked at, there was another vehicle there with a person like sleeping in their truck. So I was like, well, at least I've got the advantage here. Like he's asleep, so I don't have to worry about it. So it was pretty thick up in there. They had a lot of tree kill from like the beetles and stuff. So there's a lot of down timber everywhere. But I picked a spot that was power line clear cut, and it kind of rolled down the mountain a bit, so I could see a good ways off. And I got set up there. It was pretty chilly, and then all of a sudden, like I see down this dirt road, like side by side zip by, another side by side zip by, and then I see one like come over the ridge and like down this little trail. And I'm like, you know what? I'm just gonna pack up my stuff and I'm just gonna go because there's no point. And like the spot I was sitting at, there weren't any tracks, but I saw elk sign underneath like the snow in certain areas, so I knew there was still elk in the area. And also too, it was down at like or I think I was up at right around 9,000 feet. And so at this point too, like in November in Colorado, usually the snow's pushed down to about eight or so thousand feet. And, you'll look for the elk below that snow line. But because we had such a warm early fall and late fall, that there wasn't a lot of snow buildup. So the elk were still up pretty high. Which that was my prediction as I'm like rolling through this weekend. And then I talked to several hunters on that first and second day, and they're like, yeah, we're not seeing any elk. We're not seeing any sign. We're not seeing anything. And my mind was like, you know what? They're high. They're still way, way, way high. And so that was my point for sort of accessing that state park, was I could get up into elevation pretty quick and then, walk the rest up to where I wanted to get. And I knew that the possibility of me coming across hunters would be less, which I was still surprised that at the state park I think the parking lot at the state park was still probably, I don't know, maybe 8,700 feet or so. I could tell you, but there were still people zipping around on four-wheelers and side-by-sides, like just cruising the roads in the state park looking for elk. And in my mind, I'm like, there's no elk here, man. Like they're way up higher. So of course you're not going to be seeing any elk here. So it's just, man, it was that this particular season, it was one of those games of like getting away from the other hunters and then getting into an altitude where the elk were feeding at. Because they're not going to come down if their food source is still way up high.
Yeah.
Like, why come down and be bothered by people if you can stay up out of the way?
So about how high did you say you were when you found those elk?
About 9,200 feet.
That seems really high.
Yeah, I mean, especially for that time of year.
Yeah.
Like, to give you a perspective, so hunting early season archery, both this year and a couple years ago, like we were looking for elk at 10 to 10 and a half, and then from 10 to 9, like depending on the weather shifts and the location of like where I was in the state. And so for this to be, it was like the 11th through the 17th of November. For it to be mid-November and them to still be up that high is pretty unusual.
Yeah. If you would have found a legal elk in that herd that you encountered on your last day, you would have killed it. How would you have gotten that elk out?
Well, it would have been a fun adventure. I was thinking about that both, because it's a 3-mile hike up, so you spend some time thinking. My plan was that I was just going to quarter it out up there, and it was cool enough at night that I could hang it. And so my plan was I was going to hang it, hang as much as I could, pack out, probably the 1/4 or whatever I could fit in my pack for that first go round. And then go down and probably, I wasn't going to try to make the hike in the dark. So this area in particular I was hunting at, has a lot of moose as well. And it's also an area where there's wolves also. Wasn't as concerned about the wolves as I was the moose, about running into a moose in the dark, which I thought far more terrifying than a wolf, which now, as I say that, I think pretty ironic. But I was going to go back and rest up, and then I was actually just honestly going to hit somebody up at one of the camps of the trailhead and be like, hey, man, like, if you help me pack this out, like, I'll take care of you, and just, see where it went from there, and then just make a couple trips. I mean, it probably would have been a long day the next day, but totally worth it.
Yeah, on something like that too, it may also be a thing where you bump into a guy, hey man, you still got a cow tag? Like, I'll take you to where some elk were yesterday if you help me get one out, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, and it was crazy because even up at that like altitude, I started off, and there's obviously a load of tracks, people tracks on the trail, and then even up that high, there were still a considerable amount of tracks, but not as much, as like a mile and a half in or something like that. But there were still people like cruising up, doing a big giant loop. There was a couple alpine lakes they were going to hit in the state park, but I was like, man, it's a distance up here just to go like hiking or something like that. So it was interesting to see too, just the people sign on the trail itself.
And that's an interesting thing that I've heard a lot of stories like that in Colorado, especially during the over the counter seasons like that, but not limited to them either. That there's a lot of people out there, and that you find people a lot farther into the backcountry than you would think.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, though, it also seems like the elk and the deer adjust to it a little bit, and they don't necessarily go 50 miles into the backcountry when there's people in there. They just maybe find the little pockets and whatnot that aren't necessarily super duper far in there, but maybe are just even harder to access for whatever reason.
Yeah, I think with that, like the most of folks that go out that aren't hunting, I would say even fishing or foraging or doing any sort of the like food related activities are going to stick to the trails.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty unique, as hunters and anglers, like for us to be like, oh yeah, that's really cool. There's a trail that gets me up there, but like, a mile off the trail, there's this really cool spot I want to go check out, and we'll get into that. Whereas a person who's just going to go hike or bike or, do whatever, they're just going to go either do the loop or they're going to go up and see the site that they want to see, and they're going to come back down. I think for us, it's more of a roaming thing. And so I think to your point, John, is that you're right. I think the elk and deer behave to that too. Like there's not always somebody on the trail, and there's not always, somebody half a mile off the trail, or if there's a little bowl they're going to hide in, there until they get bumped.
So Casey, what was recovery like for your two elk? I guess we'll start with your South Dakota one first.
Yeah, I was hunting solo that morning. I guess I'll start with saying that shooting elk in the morning is a great way to do it. As long as it's not too hot and you're dealing with just direct sunlight, gives you the whole day to work on it. So like I had said, it was about a high of 50 that day, and he happened to tip over right next to a bunch of big pine trees. So there was really good shade. So I just got him quartered up right away. Everything hung up in the shade, and then kind of had a lax day. My brother was able to come out and help pack out the last two quarters. But Justin, you mentioned clear cut power lines there. So I didn't know it at the time, but on the backside of the ridge where all those elk had dumped over after my shots was a clear cut power line, just maybe 150 yards on the other side. And so the first pack out was the longest because I was maybe a mile and a half or a mile and three quarters from the elk. So I took a quarter and a trim bag out that first time, but then I was able to drive my truck down to where that power line crossed the two track. And so then the returning trips were, they weren't bad at all. It was maybe a 20, 30-minute walk from the truck to the elk, and then catch that clear cut power line, and you're kind of smooth sailing at that point. The elk in Montana was a completely different scenario, and it seems like every elk is a little bit different. Every time you get up on one, you're like, man, that is a big animal. I was with my brother, like I said, for Montana, and we were fortunate to have some close family friends there and kind of distant relatives of my brother. So we were able to call them and rally the troops. And that being on a piece of private property, they have different regulations, and often the landowner can dictate how they want carcasses taken care of. So that was basically a giant hayfield that they were on. Did have a kind of little creek drainage, so there was some natural topography for it, but you could certainly see with it being a publicly hunted area, you end up with a bunch of elk carcasses or gut piles out there. It could get to be an eyesore or a bunch of scavengers and stuff. So they required that the whole carcass get moved out of there. And so the way we handled that was treating it like we would in the backcountry, by quartering it and everything. And then we brought a game sled out there and lifted the carcass and hiding everything onto the game sled and then hauled that out. So those can get disposed of, depends on, my scenario. I was keeping the skull to do a Euro mount on my bull, so we didn't have to worry as much about the chronic wasting side of things, but there's still a lot of regulations. So each state is different. Often they'll want you to bag them and dispose of them in the proper facility, but just look up your state. So that's how we handled it. It was very dry, and it had been raining, which had melted all the snow, and then it had stopped raining that morning. So I don't know how many of you have used a game sled, but elk game sled is significant size. It's probably 4 foot by 5.5 foot. And on dry grass, it's a lot of work. But like I said, we had some friends that came out and helped drag, and we were very appreciative.
Man, I'll bet. I'm going to go on a little bit of tangent here, but I'll bring it back here in a second. So I remember back when I was a young lieutenant, when I first joined the Army, everybody in my unit had just gotten back from Iraq, and we're all just talking about how hot it was. Oh, Iraq is hot, 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 hot. Oh my God, so hot. And so when I went into my deployment a couple years later, conceptually I knew, okay, Iraq is going to be hot, right? It's in the desert. Fine, over 100 degrees, all that stuff. And then when I got there that summer, I'm like, oh my God, Iraq is hot, right? And so this is one of these things that I come up with, I call it the Iraq is hot phenomenon, where conceptually you know what the deal is, but it doesn't describe it until you get to experience it. And that is how I feel messing with an elk. Sure, an elk is big. Sure, it's heavy. I got it. And then everyone always talks about, and I'm the same way when I shot my elk, oh my God, this thing is so much bigger than a deer. It's such a pain in the rear to get out of here. Each quarter of the darn thing weighs almost as much as all the meat you get off of a good-sized white-tailed deer. A friend of mine shot a elk cow this past fall too, and that was his first elk that he'd ever killed, and it was a good-sized cow that he had. And he had a friend of his there with him, but it was kind of a young kid. It was like a 16-year-old guy. And neither one of them had really seriously packed out an animal before, and they weren't really set up for it, didn't really know what they were doing. So he called me. He's like, hey, I shot this elk. What do I do now? I was like, well, you got a lot of work ahead of you. And I kind of talked them through it on the phone, and they quartered the thing out and all that stuff. And they were in an area where you had to stay on the roads with your vehicle. So they had, I think, a 2-mile trip one way from their car to where the elk was. And I think he said it took them like 5 trips to get it all out of there, just to know what they were doing. And he called me later. He's like, John, it's been a long time since I've been this smoked as I am now, getting that darn elk out of there. And he had a buddy to help him too, man. And so, I can't imagine what it must have been like with you guys getting 2 darn elk out like that at the same darn time too. In one day, did you get it all out in that same 24-hour period?
We got it all out. I think it took us maybe 2.5 hours. But like I said, we had 4 guys that came and helped us.
Yeah.
So typically, my brother and I would help one another butcher and quarter each other's elk, but with having 2 down at the same time, I was kind of like, well, we'll just each take it by ourselves, and then when help comes, they can jump in where they need to. And it really went pretty quickly. I won't go into all the painstaking details, but it's not always that easy. And my brother and I had doubled on elk 2 years prior, and that was about 3.5 miles from the truck.
Ooh.
And I'll just leave it at we had not packed enough water, and by the time we were done field dressing the second elk and packing our first load out, it was pitch black. We didn't get back till about midnight, and our only liquid was a 5-hour energy drink, which I think is 1 ounce. So we each got half an ounce of the 5-hour energy drink, and it wasn't even for the energy. It was just that was the only liquid we had.
Oh, gosh,
so it's not always easy.
Oh my goodness! Did you shoot that second elk with your 270 as well?
I did.
Yep.
And my brother was using his 7mm Rem Mag.
Did you get similar effects with the bullet, with them catching on the offside hide like that?
I did not. This was a little, like I mentioned, I don't know if it's a factor of it being a little smaller raghorn. The meat yield was significantly different on this raghorn. The bull that I shot in South Dakota was probably a 5 or 6 year old bull, and I would say easily 30% bigger body size. And so all of my shots were a passer on this bull. But going back to elk being tough, it's never a prideful moment when you have to keep shooting. But I had, I think, 4 rounds in that bull, all in the vitals, before he tipped over.
Jeez.
And those were pass throughs. It was just one of those scenarios where he was just tough.
And did he go down within sight of you when he finally died?
He did. I knew it was a good hit on the first time. He ran about 40 or 50 yards and bedded down right away.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
I got 2 shots in him before he had bedded down. My brother, I mean, you could see the impact of the bigger caliber. He shoots the same ammunition. I believe it's copper impact from Winchester that he shoots out of his 7mm. But the devastation on the cow that he shot was noticeably more than the 270. So
it was
a 270 can take care of an elk, but I definitely have a larger caliber in mind when I get to the point where I'm going to collect rifles and not just have one to accomplish every hunt that I need it to.
I think a 270 is a good all-around cartridge, but it leans more towards deer than is elk. I think that's where serious elk cartridges start, is the 270, and then the 7 rim mag is a step up from that.
Yeah, and I could see it. It was like, I would be happier if I had a, whatever you name it, 300 win. My brother just is working on getting a 7 PRC. There's a lot of options out there.
Yeah.
But you can see why people have the elk gun, because it does make a difference.
Well, it worked, and it seemed like that Winchester copper impact ammo also really worked. You're the first guy I've talked to that's used it on elk, and so that's 3 elk here that you've either used it on or witnessed it used on elk with good results then too. So that makes me feel good. Good.
Yep. The weight retention and it mushrooms just perfectly. So
yeah, in theory, I knew it was going to be good for elk. I know they originally marketed it for deer, and then they made the copper version of it, and they said it was good for elk. But what the gun companies say is the case in reality aren't always the same thing. So good deal. I'm glad to hear that things like that worked out for you. Justin, if you had to go back and do things again on your hunt, would you make any changes?
I don't think so. I mean, probably going a little earlier, going a day or two earlier would have been good to give myself more time. But I mean, I followed sort of the system that I have in my mind of like finding and locating land. It just like I ran into roadblocks of not even access. It was just encountering other hunters. And then sort of thinking through the elevation piece a little bit more. But yeah, I don't think I did anything wrong. I think it was just a matter of time.
Yeah. Those hunts have low success rates, and finding elk seems to be 90% of the game on an elk hunt, especially on one like that. Yeah. And you found them, but you just didn't find the right ones. And maybe if you had another day or two, maybe you could have found a bull hanging out in there too.
Yeah, if I'd have had one more day. So I started too on that piece of property, like midday I went up on that trail. And so I knew I only had like 3 or 4 hours anyway. So like I would have gone back, had I had the extra day, I would have gone back the next morning and I would have hiked up the full way and probably spent the entire day like poking around up there.
Mm-hmm. All right, fair enough. Well, so what does the future hold for you, Justin?
Well, coming up next week, I'll be headed to Missouri. Yeah, next week. Just checking my calendar. Heading to Missouri. We've got our Snow Goose camp there. So
nice.
Adam Berkelmans, who's our managing editor, and I'll be heading there. We've got 8 folks coming out, and we're going to walk them through shooting, hunting, butchering, processing, cooking snow geese. So that'll be a fun, like, late season hunt.
Now, do I understand correctly that here pretty recently you did a wild pig hunt in Texas, and then you did a duck hunt in Oklahoma, and now you're doing a snow goose hunt like that, all around the same sort of format, teaching people how to do it?
Yeah, so that's a format we're moving forward with our camps. We're looking to throw a couple more in the repertoire this year. We've got our next one after this is in December. So we've traditionally held the pig camps in the spring and in the winter, kind of around hunting season, staying away from the fall. But we're looking at incorporating some different kinds of camps, different parts of the year. So we dropped our spring pig camp, and then our next one will be in December, and then we'll fill one or two camps out in the late spring, early summer, or late summer, early fall.
So where can people go to learn more about these camps?
So they can head over to harvestingnature.com as our website, and you'll see the main page there has everything. You can click on it. Or if you head over to social media and follow us at Harvesting Nature on whatever social media platform, we post about it pretty regularly, or you can find the links to our link tree, which has all that info on it as well. So probably the best spot to find it.
And do I understand correctly that your intent with these is to take people of varying degrees of hunting experience, immerse them in a sort of hunting, have people there to teach them kind of all the steps along the way? This is how you call ducks, and this is how you shoot them, and this is how you deal with them afterwards, and this is how you cook them, and all of that stuff.
Yeah, we want to create these environments where people can learn, the whole gambit. And we've had such a varying amount of attendance. We've had people that have never picked up a rifle before and they come out and shoot for the first time, to people who have, only hunted archery their entire life, or people who have been hunting for 30 years and they just want to get more attuned with the butchering and the cooking aspect of it. So really, we approach it kind of in a holistic manner with food being the focus.
Okay, man, that is really cool. That's an awesome thing that you guys are doing. Casey, what you had a heck of an elk season this year, took 2 nice bulls. What does the future hold for you think, going forward?
Yeah. That is a good question. I've been watching these turkeys that have been patterning through our property for the last month or so. I don't know. It's been like spring weather out here. Like a lot of the country, we had that extreme cold snap, and then it's been like in the 60s. So there was a group of about 20 gobblers and 30 hens right next to us on some Forest Service, just going crazy like it was springtime. So That's kind of where my mind's at right now.
When does your turkey season open up?
Archery season for residents opens up in April, and then shotgun will open up, I think, May 1st.
Okay, awesome. Well, as we wrap up, you guys have anything else that you like to share with the audience about either of your hunts? And then you can go into your podcast, social media, whatever you want to share with us.
Casey, you want to go first?
Sure. I would just say be an opportunist. Take the opportunities as they come. That was kind of a daunting one for me, pulling 2 elk tags in 1 year, but I knew I couldn't turn down the one in South Dakota, being a once in a lifetime thing. And I was able to make it work and take a few days to get into Montana. So I think you never know where the tags are going to come, where the opportunities are going to come. Even when you're in the hunt, we were driving from one Forest Service mountain area to another, and happened to run into a herd on a piece of ag that we had never hunted before. So, just be an opportunist, and the time in the field is going to be productive if you keep getting out there and don't get disheartened. So,
okay, awesome. That's good advice.
I'll build off that a little bit. So we hit on this. We did an episode as well, a podcast where Casey and I kind of did a recap. Also, we called it "The Ballad of the Modern Western Elk Hunter." It's a very music-inspired episode, I would say. But in painting these 2 or 3 very different tales, I think there's an emerging theme that comes from sort of the evolution of Western elk hunting, and just Western elk hunting in general, is that folks are getting into it. People are accessing land. People are becoming more familiar with accessing public land. So that leads into, more encounter with other hunters. That includes more pressure on the animals. So it's causing them to move around a lot. So I think following that philosophy, like some of the tenets to do is just, understand the patterns of the animals, try to understand it as best you can, be willing to move around and be mobile, to go check, if this place isn't working, if you're not seeing sign, you're not seeing animals, you're not seeing anything, like, don't just hunt it because you've hunted it for the last 10 years, like pick up and move somewhere else. And then just, the hardest part is to not get frustrated with yourself and just like trust your intuition and just have patience and just like keep doing it. I think that's kind of the big thing that I want to leave everybody with.
Yeah. Also very good advice. Well, tell us more where people can go to learn more about you guys and what you're doing at Harvesting Nature.
Sure. So like I mentioned earlier, you can head over to the Harvesting Nature website. It's got all our recipes, our articles, everything there. We carry our own spice blends as well, and cool t-shirts and hats and all that stuff that everybody else seems to have as well. Just ours is cooler. And then all on social media too. We're pretty active on Instagram and all the other platforms, and LinkedIn. It's a huge interaction point for hunters, I've learned, which is great.
Oh.
Yeah,
I had no idea.
John, you gotta get your LinkedIn synced up. It's great. We just overall just try to be as engaging and active with folks. So if you message us, you send us an email or an IM or whatever, we're pretty responsive. We'll get back with you pretty quick. So always love chatting with people, whether it's, hey, how do I do this? Or, hey, I got this random cut of meat that my uncle gave me. How do I cook it? We're always happy to support those things. So it's always fun.
All right. Well, awesome. I highly recommend the spice blends. I bought some from you guys last time I talked to you, and I used some of it last night on some venison that I shot last year, and it was great.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me on the show today and sharing some of your experiences elk hunting. I thought it was very interesting, and I hope some people learned some interesting lessons from them.
Yeah. Thanks for having us on.
Okay, I hope you enjoyed that. Be sure to give Casey and Justin a follow on Instagram. Links to their accounts are in the show notes. Same thing with the Harvesting Nature website. That website is a great resource for those of you looking for help cooking some fantastic dishes from wild game. And remember, Colorado and Montana both have application deadlines coming up. Now, like I told you earlier, sign up for a Go Hunt Insider membership with the link in the show notes with the code BIGGAMEHUNTER. Additionally, I also recently released a special members-only podcast episode in my Hunting Guns 101 training where I share some tips on hunting draw application strategies and some guidance on specific states to focus on for what I think is the best combination of good hunting and good draw odds for deer, elk, and antelope out west. I talk about Colorado and Montana in that episode, along with several other states, and I give some more detailed advice on what species you should be focusing on in each of those states. Now, existing Hunting Guns 101 subscribers already have access to that members-only podcast. Log into the members-only area, scroll down, and you'll see it in there. If you're not already a Hunting Guns 101 subscriber, let's change that. Click the link in the show notes or sign up at huntingguns101.com/order. And you'll get instant access not only to the members-only podcast I just talked about, but all of my specific recommendations for rifles, ammunition, bullets, scopes, all that stuff for hunting the whole spectrum of game. That's huntingguns101.com/order or click the last link in the show notes. Remember, you can make your dream hunt turn into a reality, and we can help. Thanks for listening. I'll see you back here next time on the Big Game Hunting Podcast.
This show may be over, but we have plenty more for you on our website. For more information on today's topic, as well as lots of other useful hunting resources, head over to the BigGameHuntingBlog.com. We look forward to having you back for the next episode. But until then, happy hunting.